Hello, and welcome back to Parley. These are my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from EyePatchNotes, hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about boss music without context as part of their lyrical narrative series. Basically, we're going to show you a couple of songs that are pivotal moments in a game's narrative, with beautiful visuals and audio elements combining together to create an experience, but there's something a little strange that has been omitted from these example songs, which will become clear very quickly through context. And so we're going to unpack that a little. These are cases where music in a game offers very involved sort of thematic hooks. It's a very climactic moment in the game, but there's one conspicuous thing absent. You'll get it through context very quickly, and then we'll discuss that. EyePatchNotes begins, one of the many wonders of audiovisual media is reinforcing visuals with audio and vice versa. So, telling parallel stories in tandem is a shortcut to immersion. Sooner pathetic fallacy than silence. Sooner pathetic fallacy than silence is a huge line that goes so hard. That's badass. Anyway, revisiting Artanelico, Melody of Elemia, a PlayStation 2 game, sadly not recommended for gameplay, but it's an example we're going to use in this parlay. The first song of this parlay will be broken into two parts. Like Chronicle Key, a song we covered in a previous lyrical narrative series, this song is sung in the constructed language hymnos, hymn-OS, like a hymn, but an OS, an operating system that sings hymns, and the language is called hymnos. I'm going to call it hymnos. For dramatic effect, please listen to the first 30 seconds to 1 minute of this song without reading the on-screen lyrics to set the framing for part 2. The safe word to proceed is Miko. Okay, I'll try to listen for that. I don't really know what you mean by that. I'm going to pause here and listen to that. Link to this is in the description, but as always, when we cover a song on Parley, I will explain what I heard to give context to people that don't want to pause the video. So let's go check that out. Ooh, okay, cool. So a couple of details. Chronicle Key, and I'll link both of these in the description. So the first song linked is the song I just listened to. Below it is Chronicle Key, a song from this same game that we did in a previous lyrical narrative parlay. Chronicle Key is in this constructed language. This song is not. I avoided looking at the lyrics, but obviously out of my peripheral vision, it was hard not to notice that they are Japanese, and I speak good enough Japanese, not great, but, like weak intermediate student level Japanese, that I could tell it was in Japanese. The thing is, this 30 seconds to 1 minute of song is a couple of things. So it's much more forceful. It's violent. We're performing a coup. We're taking over the government, the Final Fantasy government. That's a bit of the vibe. But it's sung in Japanese, but it's sung in, I don't know what specific term to use to illustrate this to you, but like Japanese opera or kabuki style vocalization. I don't know where in Japanese culture specifically this way of singing is present. To me, the easiest analog is imagine opera, like throat singing in English or whatever language you're most comfortable speaking, and then imagine that in Japanese. And so if I spoke in oldie English and started opera throat singing, but I was saying the same words I'm saying to you right now, you could speak English very comfortably, but it would still be markedly more difficult to follow what I was saying. Wouldn't you agree? That is the vibe that I got from this song. I wonder if that might have been done partly because there's a thematic reason for the song to be in Japanese, but it fits the mood of the songs in the game, like hymnos, a lot of the songs not being in Japanese. If the song feels a little bit other, a little bit removed from everyday Japanese speaking person life. And so maybe that's one of the many reasons they chose this style of singing. Again, link is in the description. You'll notice this within 30 seconds, but that is basically what I heard. And otherwise it was like the expected 30 seconds to 1 minute opening of a song that will be a climactic, somewhat orchestral, somewhat Japanese opera singing, action thing. Like we're gonna go kill God, I presume. I skimmed this partly beforehand, so I think I'm picking up what you're putting down. A little bit of backstory. In universe, in this game, Revatail, Vocaloids for simplicity. Okay, Revatail. Anyway, we're going to call them Vocaloids, are androids that cast music, they sing songs, using ancient words, the hymnos from before. As was teased in the Parley introduction, these Vocaloids are running him OS. Songs are programs with specific purpose, such as Chronicle Key keeping a wrathful and once loyal to humans Vocaloid asleep. Sing the language of ancients to still God. Sing the language of humans to kill God. Hence why this is in Japanese. If the feelings behind a Chronicle Key were humanity is grateful and sorry, but please go back to sleep, then the feelings behind this song, we're going to call Purger, are humanity will not live in fear anymore. This is made evident in the more aggressive, violent tone of Purger and its lyrics predominantly in Japanese rather than hymnos. Yes, okay, so in the description, you'll notice that the title of the YouTube video for this song we listened to is exec_paja and then a slash, and the title of the Vocaloid that's gonna sing it, I guess, Paja, Purger, Paja. I'm pretty sure that is supposed to mean the title of the song is Purger. So I'm gonna assume those are the same thing and I have the right thing. That's what you linked. I'm sure that's the right song. It's called Purger for our purposes. Spoken in English, which I have some experience with. English spoken with a heavy Japanese accent. Paja, it becomes. Okay, fair enough. Yes, I do think it is pretty obvious from the mood and sound of the music that it is a song about not just keeping God asleep. Let's put it like that. Now, this is great and all, EyePatchNotes continues, but the name of the song is only obliquely available through dialogue in-game. It's not like a song title card pops up when this part of the game starts playing. And subtitles, same problem as Chronicle Key, the immersed player or listener will have to extract the meaning from outside the game. Games like Limbus Company do actually have on-screen lyrics during boss fights, usually a song by the band Millie, typically at the end of a canto, so it can be done. You could put the lyrics on the screen, and some games do. Unfortunately, the second boss track we will discuss comes from another game that again failed to include in-game lyrics. So here's the crux of the parlay. You get it through context now, right? These are cases where the music offers a lot of thematic hooks, but no direct lyrics, specifically lyrics, were left out. Everything else seems to have been designed to be as thematically resonant as possible, immersive, or impactful in some way too. Remember my example before, you have this RPG village and you need to go repair they tell you in the story like, oh, there's this robot that sings a song that prevents us from all dying and it's broken, you got to go fix it so it can keep God asleep so we don't all get killed. And you go, wow, that sounds rather serious. Let's go. And then you get your fantasy adventure party and la da 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 da, and you get to the top of the mountain or whatever is where I'm imagining these being sung. And indeed, there's a broken Vocaloid, and you fix the broken Vocaloid, and then it starts singing. And the song you hear is Chronicle Key, a song in a language that we, and I assume the characters in the story, maybe don't understand. Imagine that. You know what the song is for. You were told through context something, at least, maybe not the true thing, but you were told something about why are you doing this? It would be weird and bad, I think, if the game didn't tell the player anything, even something that's not true, about why they are fixing this thing. There's some context, right? Very likely. If you were in this situation in real life somehow magically, you would know some context about why you were doing this, so you probably wouldn't risk life and limb to do it. But then the song starts up and it's not in a familiar language. Okay, but then you play the song that kills the god and now it is in a familiar language. There's a drama to that. There's a drama that doesn't really have to do with what the lyrics of the songs are, although one might suspect. And I was saying before that I think if you had the lyrics, to some extent, that would affect your experience of the song. You might not feel the same thing from Chronicle Key playing if you had the lyrics on the screen of oh, I don't know what this is, it's fantasy language. Oh, but it says right here, it just peacefully keeps God asleep. Okay, no big deal. You see what I mean? There's a drama created by not knowing what that is a little bit. I say this not because I completely disagree that it's bad for the lyrics to not be here, EyePatchNotes, just to present what I see as the counter argument. I think there is potentially a benefit to not having the lyrics here, as well as also some, I think, fairly obvious detriments, like it's unclear, or let's say you're playing the game in English, and you don't speak Japanese, well, this effect then happens again for the song Purger, as well as for Chronicle Key, because you don't speak Japanese. And they could make a new version of the song in English, of course, but if the original song is lovely, maybe then having the subtitles would make sense, because you're meant to understand. You know, I think the game would be giving a much clearer statement of intent if, when played in English or with English subtitles, the Japanese song Purger had English subtitles, but the Hymnos song Chronicle Key did not have English subtitles. That would seem to make the matter clear. You would compare the game's attitude towards subtitles with this song, and it would be clear, even though these are both songs that you, if you only speak English, might not understand, you're meant to have understanding for this second song, but not for this first song. However, we've gotten to our favorite part of media criticism ever. Yes, it's your favorite part too, which is death of the author. Say it louder for the people in the back. It doesn't matter which one is the official thing that the creators of the game intended. You might even go as far as to say, if you speak English and you don't speak enough Japanese to understand Purger, even though it's in Japanese, affected though it might be most of it, the game is different in English, somewhat different. Some of the subtext, the very small amount of the subtext, is different in English, you could argue. At the very least, there's a separate valid reading of the game that is the game's text if you play the game in English, separate from if you play the game in Japanese. Who knows how much it matters? I haven't played this game, so I don't know. But there is a bit of meaning change there. There is no, we can't just discern the true meaning by figuring out what the creators of the game intended. After all, it's also possible that they didn't intend any of this topic. They did it and were not building the game out based on the consequences of making these decisions. For another example, it's possible that they just didn't have a good translation for the Hymnos song and the Japanese opera singy song ready for the game. It's possible they ran out of time, and so they meant to include that, but they didn't. The game having this detail in it or not already doesn't tell us whether that's what the developers wanted to have happen, because video game development is a mess and it's crazy, let alone it doesn't tell them what their intent was. They don't even necessarily know fully what their intent was. When an artist makes a painting, you can't know the reason for them making every single stroke of the brush in every single place the painting has any paint on it. They don't know that. They themselves do not know that in many cases. So already we need to dispense with this idea that there is which I don't think you're very strongly evoking, but I think it's particularly important here. We have to assume that the text is what it is, and it doesn't matter what the people who created it intended it to be like. It matters what it is. And it is at least two different things, depending on whether you understand Japanese well enough to understand the opera song singing in Purger. So there's that as well. Already there's kind of a fork there. Additionally, we have my conclusion from before, which is that just because the game doesn't show its lyrics doesn't necessarily mean that its goal is to mystify. It could be arguably more clear not to have the lyrics. That is, I think that the mood of these songs is pretty evident from listening to them. One could argue that the lyrics don't even add much to that. And a lot of people get intimidated by what they see as interpreting literature. Unfortunately, for many people, it triggers their experience of doing that in school, the time when that subject was bastardized and ruined for many people forever, instead of being about actual understanding and discussion. At least I have a bachelor's degree in English, and I think it was bastardized for every moment of my entire time doing that. And I didn't have all bad teachers. It just, you cannot check a box with participation. You would have to have a discussion about really discussing. It would need to be valid to not participate in the discussions, which it can't be, or they can't take attendance and score you as your student participation. A student participation graded class can never easily have good discussion, at least not reliably. And my experience was that they do not, despite plenty of the students there and plenty of the professors I took the classes with having plenty of good things to say. So unfortunately, that was a lot of people's only experience with interpreting lyrics or literature. But it can be very fun to just read a thing and see what feelings you get. I don't think that is very fun for most humans currently, but it can be fun. The reason people think it isn't is because they had a crappy version of it their whole life, I think. And so that's going to take a while to decompress or almost like recover from the trauma of, I'm not trying to be dramatic. I think that is what's going on. That's certainly how it was for me. I like being interested in things and chewing on a piece of media I'm interested in. What I do not like is the way that I was meant to do that for the first 20 years of my life. And it took some time to get from point A to point B. My point is, I don't think that just showing the player the lyrics will actually get them more immersed a lot of the time. I think for a lot of people, that is the thing that will make them stop focusing on the feeling of the game and instead try to like gain the right information. Putting it another way, there is something a little worth discussing in why people want to know what the Hymnos lyrics mean. I mean, the language was specifically designed to be not something you could understand. So unless the audience is pursuing the true meaning, which does not exist, of what the piece is, privileging what the game says rather than just how it feels to the audience on the ground, which I don't think really makes sense. Surely it just doesn't matter very much what the song in Hymnos means. The whole point of having it in Hymnos was partly to make it so we don't know what it means, or there wasn't coherent artistic intent behind that decision and they just decided to do it. That would be fine too. We don't know. The point is, the effect is, we don't understand. You can make a game that you enjoy because you understand the songs, but I don't think that is the exact same text as if you play Ars Tonelica without understanding the songs. Those are different. You would have to be making an argument for, I think this game is fun, when you also add on understanding this song that the game intends you not to understand or presents you as not understanding. And I think there's a difference there. You can prefer one or the other. Again, I'm aware that it's a tricky argument because in build systems, often the game requires that you understand how this works to use it for meaningful build decisions, but the game just doesn't contain that information. And so, like the manual to a game, you could argue that you're not really playing Monster Hunter or whatever unless you look up what the abilities actually do, because the game intends you to use those abilities using their technical explanations tactically to win the fights in the game, but omits that information. And you could argue this is more arguably just a mistake. There's not much actual value added. But they surely didn't include the technical information because they thought that it would overly distract players. So it kind of is the same thing. And it's just that if the game sort of requires that you know that information, you could argue that goes beyond just like, oh, it might be interesting if the song is a mysterious language the audience doesn't know. Okay, huge aside. It's a giant mess. Let's look at another example and see what we can see about that hypothesis or pair of hypotheses. What is the point of including or not including the lyrics when a song with audiovisual elements that's meant to be this deeply immersive thing is shown in game? It's a trade-off. We can agree it's some amount of trade-off. You might not individually feel like it is. You might feel like, no question, I would prefer it in all ways if they just showed the subtitles. But you can agree there is an effect caused if you don't include the subtitles. Even if you'd prefer if they did, it does do something to not include the subtitles. And so we might compare, well, is it more beneficial to include them or not, So the second example, breaking the world, still makes the Parley author tear up. Card and Seal, a Steam game, not soft recommend, is a roguelike card battler where every card has an effect and a direction. That's where this song is from. Casting a card normally progresses the game state by attacking or drawing, whereas discarding a card moves the player in that direction on the board, generally to evade or line up an attack. However, the real meat and potatoes is the Muse system. Fulfilling certain conditions will debut the qualified Muse with full screen effects and music. Muses embody a specific flavor of deck building, such as a muse for playing high-cost cards, or muses that reward creating one-time use cards. Playing a given deck archetype builds a soundtrack keyed to that archetype, as muses make the mechanics more powerful or more lenient. That's cool. The convert keyword, for example, puts a backside on a card. Casting a convert card flips it to its generally more powerful side, and there are effects that skip a card to this more powerful side. A good number of convert cards are associated with the Gunvolt setting, linked to Card and Seal footage, and I'll link that in the description, and thus a convert deck will more often than not use songs from that IP as a backdrop. Interesting. So there's a sort of sound, specifically, a soundtrack effect when you play certain strategies. All this is a preface to say, the rival character in the game has a muse too, and her muse power is to mute all others. When she takes the stage, no other music can play except Breaking the World. Mechanically, this means the player loses access to their muses and the game is much harder. Imagine a Limbus Company boss suddenly disabling ego usage, or, in many games, disabling your ultimates. The fight can be won, but some passives and bigger attacks were sealed away. Right. So again, we have an example where the game gives you a tremendous amount of context and sources of impact when this song plays, but is obviously, you know what's coming, right? The game is not going to show the lyrics on screen when the song is playing. So why or why not? What is going on with that? The game clearly wants you to have a lot of context when you hear the song. The game wants you to understand and feel something when it puts this song on. It's a very deliberate choice. As we talked about before, if you get into the weeds of like, what was their intent? What does it mean officially? The problem is that it's entirely possible that they stopped there. It could just be, it is cool and dramatic that your game actions change the music, but the rival has a very scary power that changes the syntax of the game so that your actions do not change the music anymore, or you can't do those actions. That feels powerful and impactful and dramatic and raises the stakes, and that might be it. That might be all it is. And so they might say, well, we didn't include the lyrics because they're not relevant at all. It was literally just like because we wanted that gameplay benefit. Or they might say something like, well, we didn't include the lyrics because we knew people would look it up online and it would be distracting while listening to the song. Okay. Or they might say they didn't include the lyrics because we think you can get we want you to get the meaning of the song, but we think you can get it without hearing the lyrics. And we just decided not to include a settings option where you can turn on subtitles if you want to, which isn't a huge accessibility win, but it really only isn't a huge accessibility win if that is the thing that you were trying to get out of it, which maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You get my point. Depending on what if you get into like, well, what was their intent? I mean, they might not even agree. The studio that made this game probably has people that wanted one thing and people who wanted another thing. So there isn't even one intent in the first place in many cases. They meant something by it, and it is the game that shipped, basically. And I always dismiss these arguments chiefly because they're an argument about being correct, about there being a single correct answer, which doesn't do anything or have any utility in the world that we actually live in. But it is still useful to consider the author intent as a way to stock a list of things that could be effects of not including the lyrics. It definitely could do all of those things that I mentioned. And it doesn't matter which one is the official one, that doesn't really exist or do anything. But it's still useful to consider, well, what are all of the reasons I can think of why you might do this? And then does it succeed at those effects? And we can take a look. It's going to be very difficult to represent this chunk of song with you, but just as an example to demonstrate that the song is trying to communicate meaning without just its lyrics, there's an important part that we want to show you. So the various Muse songs are generally 90-second snippets using the IP being depicted. For Breaking the World, it is a crystallization of her anguish. To skip to a relevant part of the song, there's a part that says, "Take hold through damp hands of your love, slip these fragments of you, even now, and then there's a very distinct pause in the vocals. And then it says, "with not but a sound," and then there's a pause and a guitar escalation before it starts singing the "Breaking the World" part of the song. That part of the song, we like a bit of word painting, has notably the lyrics "with not but a sound" directly preceding gaps in the vocalization, stylized by the Parley author as those apostrophes. Yeah, I was able to find that part of the song easily because of that. Good job. Silence is used as a lyrical idea and in performance, and that is also the transition between what could be seen as somber reminiscence and then retaliation. Breaking the World progresses from soft piano to more aggressive instruments, mirroring the narrative of the boss in question. Right. Before that part of the song, there are these wistful sounding, you worded it as hard guitar, then soft piano, wistful guitar, and then guitar escalation later. At this turning point in the song, it just sounds very easily audibly to anybody with any experience thinking about emotions in music. It will sound wistful and sad and regretful. Then there's a noteworthy pause and a slowdown in how the lyrics are sung for a minute, almost as if to mirror the final straw or a turning point in a dramatic conversation. And then the song very clearly gets more aggressive and resolute. And this is something that you could very easily hear if just listening to this song without reading lyrics. It's in the description if you want to see if you feel that way yourself. But I reckon most people would agree it's not like completely impossible to understand what this song is getting at without its lyrics. Its lyrics are also about that thing. And so you could then argue, well, do the lyrics create any additional meaning? And maybe no. Maybe no would be an argument that is on the table. I am gonna play devil's advocate against that point as well, because I don't totally agree, but I also think it's valid to consider that it is not that hard to get that idea from the song without the lyrics to the song. As in the previous example, I also imagine that this game has your rival character, like, I don't know, is there a story element to this game? Like if your rival character says rival-y things, and the story is that you have a falling out with your rival, and now you're kind of at odds. I mean, the player already knows that. And then the rival's persona, activates their ability, and the song sounds like wistful and then resolute. And the player a lot of people are just naturally going to go, oh yeah, of course this is what their song is like. It's kind of sad, and they're sort of punching back against me, which is what happened in the story. Like, yeah, okay, great, good. I feel like I got that from listening to that part of the song. So that's interesting. And I mean, I gather, EyePatchNotes, from the way you're talking about the song, that this still makes you tear up when you hear it. If you really liked this game, that it resonates with you in some way, that it may have resonated with you without its lyrics. Or maybe the reason you did this parlay is because it resonated with you once you looked up the lyrics. I'm not sure. I think this parlay is more interesting. I'm glad you didn't say that. There are two framing questions at the end of this parlay. You said, does the boss fight have lyrics that are keyed to the characters in question? And if the player stops to smell the roses, can they glean the meaning behind the lyrics? And I guess the thrust of the devil's advocate position I've been presenting for this parlay is that they definitely can, I think, even without stopping to smell the roses. And the question is basically, what do the lyrics add? I think it is demonstrable that you absolutely can put this into an equation and get out meaning without the lyrics. And so the question is, what benefit does adding the lyrics have, or what effects does adding the lyrics have? Certainly, some amount more people will get it, if you will. Not necessarily the exact correct meaning, but like, these aren't the most oblique lyrics of all time to interpret. Like, if the lyrics are saying, days long gone, long lost time, thoughts entwine, certainly it was fate, you would smile and laugh while, according to EyePatchNotes, wistful guitar plays. I don't think it would be rocket science for many people to conclude. Like, it's not going to require any English degree to interpret these lyrics, I would argue. Not in a negative way. That's good. They're clear. So obviously, if you include the lyrics, some amount more people will understand the thrust of the song. And I'm sure it will also somewhat distract some people from the game as well. There will be a friction to some people who will read the lyrics, but then feel like it's a lot to juggle while playing the game, who, if you did not present the lyrics, wouldn't have distracted themselves by reading them, likely wouldn't have thought, oh, I need to go check the lyrics, unless they just decided they liked the song prior. And I think there's a reasonable chance they would still get the meaning of the song. And so the question basically is to put that on a scale with this, more people understanding the song. More people understand the song, but also some people who would have understood the song already have a worse or distracted experience at the same time. And which one do you prioritize? It's interesting because in Limbus Company, the example you brought up, indeed, in the boss fights for each climactic boss fight of a season, there is a custom song designed specifically for that character in that story beat moment, with lyrics often even like in the language that the character like is inspired by the culture of. Very custom songs that have the lyrics appear on the screen around the boss fight. It's a turn-based combat game, and so around the boss fight. And it's turn-based combat. So you totally could, I have, stopped playing Limbus Company, like gotten into the boss fight and just not attacked yet. There's no time limit or anything. It's a turn-based combat game. And then you see the lyrics on the screen and read them or listen to the song as you go. I like this artist, so I usually just listen to their songs like before. And I don't play Limbus Company actively anymore. But you know, you could, if you wanted to, stop and just appreciate the music. Now, obviously, this is probably a better fit for a game that is turn-based, which I don't know if these other two games are. Actually, watching Card and Seal, it's not that I don't know if it's turn-based, but that I'm not sure if what I'm seeing is turn-based. I actually don't know, even having watched gameplay footage. Whereas Art and Elico, I'm not really sure. So anyway, I would imagine it's different, is the point. Unless the game fully allows you to stop while gameplay is ongoing, then you are obviously paying some cost if you try to read the lyrics like while playing the game to understand them. So I don't know. I feel like that is a trade-off that is present, and therefore it seems reasonable to like consider not including them. Now, I will say before, I made a point about access, like that it could be an accessibility issue to not include the lyrics. I think that's where it's tricky, because I think it's fair for the piece to say, we intend this to provide its full meaning without its lyrics. One might then ask, why are there lyrics, if that's the intent? Like, why isn't the song just a cappella, or, you know, not purely vocals, but like I don't know how to say, there are human vocalists, but they don't sing words, basically. They sing, you know, rather than like specifically words or whatever. You might well ask. I do think that that's not always what lyrics are for. Sometimes lyrics are an interesting way to texture a sung note. That is the word you're saying, and the sound that you sing when you sing the word, the note that you sing when you say the word, can combine to create a feeling or a certain way of playing. Just like how you can strum a guitar multiple different ways or things like that. You can kind of, you know, you can play bass, you can play slap bass, you can play bass with a pick, you know, etc. And so this is a way that you can change the sound of the instrument of the human voice. And if there's gonna be lyrics, they might as well like be about what the song feeling is about. But then it begs the question, well, but now there are lyrics that you could clarify, so shouldn't you just include them as an access issue? Which I think is tricky. Again, like much of the time you can argue it's not of much significance what the lyrics specifically are, but that's also very debatable. I mean, is it? So I guess I'm stuck in the idea that for the audience to be intended to explore and engage in the meaning of the song, which they evidently are because the song is there creating meaning, you are kind of put into a place where to sort of allow the audience the ability to explore the song without friction with the game, you probably should offer the option to switch on subtitles, I think is where I'm arguing myself into a corner about. Even though I would insist that a lot of the time it's quite valid and people can be very overly fixated on like knowing the real meaning, and therefore they might be tempted to just always turn them on when they would arguably have a much better experience if they didn't, some people. But then also if you become just a more thoughtful person, surely you won't resist just like interpreting some straightforward song lyrics about a game you're interested in. And therefore maybe the game should just be for the people who will enjoy it, and you should always just include the song lyrics anyway. But then that's like saying that it isn't valid to try to have a song be meaningful without its lyrics. Like it's almost like the people making the song can't say no and say, well, I don't think the lyrics are meaningful. I don't want you to get distracted by the lyrics. And the player base, are now saying, well, you can't choose that. You know, that's not a valid form of artistic intent, which I don't agree with. Like, I think it is. So I don't know that. Oh, I don't know what to say about that. That's tricky. That's good. I think. I think this is a substantial point. There is some conflict of how meaning is created in these situations, and it is strange that games don't often include their stuff on the screen, but it is a different issue in some ways, I think, than when this happens in, again, of course, it's me, so I'm going to say build systems. Because in build system games, often it's not clear that you even can use the game piece. The game piece doesn't physically, technically work unless you know specifically what it does. Like, if I'm speedrunning this monster and I have a set on that boosts my damage after a certain period of time, and I can't easily see the visual effect of that going on or distinguish it from other effects, Monster Hunter does give you a little pop-up that says, but then if I play the game, And I don't know if the effect is turning on. Can I actually use that effect? I would argue mostly no. You literally can't use the effect in a certain sense unless you know, like have an explanation of what it does. And therefore, putting that explanation in the game, there's less of an argument against doing that. You kind of can't actually use it unless you do that. On the other hand, we can agree that most of these songs will have at least an impact, regardless of whether you include their lyrics in the game's description, almost inevitably. Like, there's almost no way that these songs won't have some impact on the audience without their lyrics. Like, it would be, and it would be crazy to say this song does literally nothing to the game. It changes the game in no way at all, unless I know the lyrics. Like, it definitely does change the game, but then the lyrics obviously change your experience to that song. So what do we do with that? I also bring up the build systems version of the issue again, partly because, like, if you're playing a lot of different video games, what you'll have noticed is that older games just tended not to include details, period, basically. Yeah, you know, and so I think EyePatchNotes, you strike me as someone who's played enough games like this where you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, like all that stuff I said, you know, whatever. But if we're being real, the real reason why a lot of these games don't include these details is because they're from a previous time when games just didn't include their details as much. I would argue gaming as a medium was just less mature way back when. And this has some unusual effects. One of them is that because most of the people that are involved in the topic or concept are insiders, like they know a lot about it, they're willing to be very invested in it, they couldn't have gotten there, partly because it's so inaccessible, without knowing and looking up a bunch of stuff. Therefore, games assume that it would be, of course, irrelevant to include these details, because anybody who plays this would just look it up. Players like that. And to me, this is the common mistake that a lot of early human pursuits make, being fixated on what the people who are already doing it already think they want, rather than imagining what would be good and trying to do that. And so, in a lot of earlier game designs, was it more sensible to not include the details of what items in the build system did? No, it was even worse, because you often could not look it up. Well, I mean, you could maybe buy a strategy guide that would sometimes tell you, though often not. You often couldn't, but you know, a good amount of the time that was a business that people did, sure. So you could say in some cases it was for money. That's not good art, necessarily, that they just decided to make that part harder to engage with unless you pay more money. That would be like looking at a painting, and just as you're spending enough time looking at the painting to try to understand it, a person pulls you aside and blindfolds you and says you have to pay another $20 or you can't keep interpreting the painting. This is at odds with art. I hope you would agree. Art can earn money and not be compromised, but probably not like that without being pretty compromised, I would argue. Anyway, your mileage may vary. And surely if you could look things up less, that means it's even worse not to include the details, right? The reason those details were not included is, in most cases, I would argue, absolutely nothing to do with whether the people who made the game thought the details were relevant. It doesn't have anything to do with that. They thought they were relevant in many cases. That's why they included them. They didn't include the details of what the build system did because they thought it was either redundant, the audience would be the kind of people who would just look this up, or that it was part of the fun of the game to find those details organically, to talk with your friend on the bus about where to catch this Pokemon or whatever. And indeed, having grown up somewhat during this transitionary period of human technology and gaming culture, I did experience that part and also this more modern side. Nowadays, it's less important to include the details in the game in the sense that you can look them up much more easily, or you're much more likely to be able to look them up. But it's also less clearly a part of the game to be uncertain because you can just look them up. And so I think a lot of games have not so much been convinced that it is beneficial to include these details, but more just been convinced that the discovering it organically thing is dead, and therefore that isn't a reason to not include the details, if that makes sense. Therefore, some games are just kind of by default, if you will, including the details rather than excluding them. My opinion, and it's just an opinion, is that most of the current games industry doesn't actually have a reason to include the details. doesn't actually have that good of an awareness of the fun constructed by having the meaning present in the game, but is just no longer purposefully not including the details for some perceived benefit. They're just kind of at neutral, and they think, well, I could just include the details, I suppose. I don't think that for many of them they would say, oh, well, obviously, like, an in-depth understanding of the psychology behind someone using build systems is that they'll want to use these details to make an informed opportunity cost decision, which is in a cosmic sense the entire point of including this whole part of the game. Therefore, we should include the build details. I believe that almost all current game developers are not thinking that, have not thought that. I'm sure they will when it's presented. I'm not that smart. It's not that, it's kind of obvious. They just haven't thought of it yet. They will be able to think of it. They're smart people. And when they do, they will either agree with me or come up with some other point that dissents. And then we'll learn that maybe it doesn't make sense to include those details some of the time. Go figure. I've even seen interesting, new, very modern, usually very new games built entirely around this gap existing. A really good example, if you want to look up some footage of this game, you'll see this pretty quickly, is, what is this game called? Yoshi and the Mysterious Book. It's a Nintendo Switch game that just came out. In this game, you are Yoshi and you inhabit a living storybook. And it's relevant to our conversation because whenever you do anything that you haven't done before, eat a certain kind of enemy, throw an egg. Yoshi can eat enemies and turn them into eggs that Yoshi can throw as projectiles if you haven't played a Yoshi game before. And you throw a projectile at a new enemy. If you discover a new thing, if a new part of the game occurs, basically, the game dynamically draws a diagram on the background of the game when that thing happens and puts up some text explaining to you the knowledge that you just revealed, basically taking notes for you as you uncover parts of the game. Something I've been wondering when we're going to get. It's a pretty obvious thing to do in some way, right? You activate a synergy between two effects, and let's say the game wants a sense of discovery. Well, why not have it be that the game doesn't say there's a synergy between those two effects, but the very first time you use them and something happens that isn't what the effects said they did, instead of the player just needing to be able to read through the visual noise and see that that's there, the game simply makes a note that something unusual happened, and you can like investigate, or the game literally just tells you, and then you know by experimenting, you don't have to like manually keep track of all those things. You will need to know to employ that thought. You're making a build 10 hours later, and you're gonna have to go, oh yeah, there was that one synergy effect between those two effects. Where was that? Right here, got it, good. And because the game took a note down, all you would have done is just typed that exact same sentence yourself, but now you can pull it back and use it for something in the build system. This has an interesting border with AI writing, actually. A lot of people who use large language models like ChatGPT to write essays for them often say something to the effect of, I would have written this if I was writing it manually. ChatGPT just wrote what I would have written for me, which isn't really true. Like, they're not aware that if they thought about it on their own, they would come up with like their own conclusions, and that the thinking is the point of it. And I also think educators are to blame for not clarifying that the reason I'm asking you to do this is so you'll think about it, not to get the final product, which obviously is not beneficial. You're just writing a middle school essay or whatever. Obviously that isn't the point of it. The point is like you gaining this benefit by doing it yourself, and maybe they need better ways to test that as well. But anyway, it should be pretty clear why that cheating in that way either means the course is pointless or you are making the learning useless. And so you should either quit the course if you can, or just stop using the AI to write the thing. Those are the only two sensible options that I can see. This is a little bit different because it's something you did come up with. You specifically did. I think the best way to get the game to auto-transcribe things like this would be for the game to say it in as cold code as possible. Literally just record the information like experimental data, and that's it. Letting the player synthesize on their own is the fun, is the whole point of the game. So it's not good for the description to do any synthesis, in my opinion. Or if it feels convenient for the description to do synthesis, maybe the game is just boring and tedious. And so you want the game to skip steps for you, but it should just not include those steps, so they wouldn't need to be skipped. Anyway, but if the game says something like, oh, fire plus dark equals lifesteal over time, like heal over time or something like that, and the game literally takes a note of that by just writing fire plus dark equals heal over time, and that's it. Like no other, faffing or wording it or, again, synthesizing it in some way. I feel that is different than doing the thinking for the player. I feel that just gets a nuts and bolts convenience out of the player's way. For example, if the player had to note that down themselves, they would never experiment in important combat situations, because doing so would be useless. They would lose the data from that experiment. So having the game automatically record strictly the data from that interaction, very little more than a combat log, basically, that highlights when you do a new thing, is good in a way that, like, having a large language model write your essay for you is not, I would argue. Okay, and this is definitely very related to the topic that you brought up. It totally is, because it's wrapped up in that feeling of, like, is it good to add this aid? Well, that basically depends on how you're interpreting, language or information in that moment in the game. Just like the example with the song lyrics on the bottom maybe distracting you from playing the game moment to moment, and then if the meaning of the song was gonna come through anyway, but then the lyrics are just distracting you from focusing on the game, that can be called a bit of a loss, or maybe it's not as good that way. Yet there will be people who are trying to juggle both at the same time, and giving them lyrics seems sensible. Yeah, I mean, I think it is then reasonable, as long as we can agree that games that have something like Hymnos can then reasonably choose to not include subtitles for that. It is allowed to be subtext of a game that you don't know what that language means, even if players are able to decode it separately if they want to. I think that we're cool about that, and maybe I agree that games should basically just always endeavor to include subtitles. I think compared to the effort made to create these moments in these games, that's not asking a lot. Not to say subtitles are trivially easy to include, but I think in the face of what the game is willing to do, that would not be a very large additional add in many cases. And these aren't going to have that much impact if they happen too often anyway, so it seems reasonable to want subtitles like an okay amount of the time when there are these pithy moments, but maybe the game will sometimes choose to default them to being off. I think that is reasonable, as long as the game offers them. And sometimes it might make sense to default them to on. Again, in Limbus Company, you have a very ideal situation where it's a turn-based combat, you have kind of a 3D environment, so the lyrics could be sort of in the environment, and we're kind of seeing a diorama of the thing the song and the thrust of that chapter of the story are about. And so it's a pretty good fit for having the lyrics be there. That makes sense. And I guess what I'm left critiquing is, for many games, I just want the game to be willing to choose one of those options. It's the same thing with the build system details. I'm not saying it's never ever good for the game to ever withhold any information about anything that works that way in the game, but I don't currently believe most games are doing it the way they're doing it because they have really thought about the benefits of doing it one way and then the other way, and then they chose one of those things. They chose a way to do it, but not by seeing at least two sides of the discussion, which I think is inherently bad. There's really no reason not to do that. Many games are choosing it this way simply because they haven't heard any other opinions about how to do it. They just can't think of any other ways. They genuinely have not occurred to them to do it any other way. So yes, they chose to do it this way, but it would have been a much better choice and would have fit the game better. It would have improved the game in some small way that adds up if there were more choices on the table for how to do it. Maybe then for the lyric thing, it is really different, because I guess I don't really see why you wouldn't include the option to have the subtitles, even if you choose not to default them to being on. Finally, you probably want to do something to indicate when the song is like intended not to be understandable. So like for a Hymnos song, you'd probably want to put up like a character in Hymnos. I assume there's a written version of the language. I think I remember from Chronicle Key. Let's double check that. Just to refresh my memory, I'm kind of triple checking at this point, but yeah, there's a custom script. That's what that is. Sure. Go figure. And so some little indicator like that to telegraph to the audience that this is a language you could understand, and then if you want it, here is the subtitle option, or they default to it on, but if it's distracting, you can turn it off. Games bonus points if you include this option right in game, like as a song with a subtitle pops up, the game just very quietly in the corner goes subtitles, and you can choose to turn them on or off based on what you want. Bonus points, but go figure. But I do still think it's reasonable for the game to choose sometimes to default to them on and sometimes to default to them off. I think it is distracting in a way that is not just anti-intellectuality to see the song lyrics some of the time. And I feel like these are really good examples where the lyrics are relevant, but the song is interpretable without the lyrics as well. And so it provides a clean question about the subject. As always, very excellent examples as well. You gave examples in particular in this case where there's enough context from the game or what the game might be like that one can imagine all of the understanding you could have except the lyrics of the song, whereas some games have songs that are like a thematic moment in the game, but in no way has the game actually built up like what that is about. And there are even examples like some of the Limbus Company songs. They are contexts that you've kind of learned over the course of your time playing the game, but a good amount of the time they fill in something that was a little off screen. Like, there's almost no time in Hong Lu's canto where you see him hanging out with this important person in his life. I'm avoiding for spoilers, but if you played Hong Lu's canto in Limbus Company, you know what I mean. There's almost no time during the story up until the final boss fight of his canto when Hong Lu spends time with this important person in his life amicably, like just having fun. But then his canto end song is about that, like about some time that they were just like chatting and he was asking questions as he grew up and this thing. To me, it shows us a bit of an off-screen part of that part of his relationship. So, therefore, even though the song is highly contextualized, and you probably will appreciate like the somewhat wistfulness of this song, it kind of sounds like Hong Lu. I really like that song. At the same time, you kind of haven't been built up. It's kind of adding additional context in a way. And so I think that is also a meaningful thing to consider. I didn't give that too much talk during this because we would just have to speculate. But something we could look at for the future is, well, we analyzed a little bit of one example song you gave, but just how much of the song actually is clear from context? Just how much of the meaningful context in the story is being communicated through the song's lyrics? How much can you even effectively communicate through lyrics? It's often hard even to follow the lyrics of a song spoken in your native language. That is tricky sometimes, yet undeniably can add real detail. That's not even getting into the whole litany of music that is deliberately about a subject that sounds at odds with its instrumentalization. You know, the song sounds happy and peppy, but is actually about like brutally murdering someone you dislike. Just to name a completely random example from the Milgram project from the Pistol Whip series of Parley. That's a whole technique in music and arguably has a sort of access gap if you don't have the lyrics in some way. Now, giving that example from the Milgram project, the Pistol Whip Parley, yes, it's a song that is a march. This is the Purge March, if you haven't listened to those Parley. It's a marching song, da 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 da, but then there are parts where she gets really angry and it sounds like she's gonna kill you with a hammer, and you can hear that. Like it is in the song without the lyrics. But if we were to talk about this more, you get it. We would want to dig into how does that work exactly, though? Like, there are a few interpretations of that without the lyrics there. So, yeah, a really interesting topic that has a lot of additional depth. I chose to explore it this way. You gave one other example that I didn't feel like we had time for, and I prioritized that, so I hope that was okay. I would love to do it again. There's more to discuss about this topic. I think at this point, I want you to drive a little more and tell me where from here, or did you not want to hear about any of that? We'll see. You'll let me know. Folks, if you enjoyed this, we've got plenty more of these, and I know some of you just support the show through the Patreon link, but if you want your own, you can also get it there. See you in the next one.